Jared is here from Offsite, a really friendly company of ours, to talk about what Offsite does and how Offsite helps chiefs of staff and strategic executive assistants with their planning and workload for events. And Jared's been such a great partner to us. We've worked together now for a couple years on different things. And Jared is sponsoring this Nova Chat, allowing it to be free for all of you. So Jared, couple minutes over to you and you can share with people what you do.
Sure. Thanks for having us again. I'm Jared, founder of Offsite. We plan offsites. And so if you want to learn more, go to offsite.com. But no, we plan offsites and team retreats all over the globe. We partner with chiefs of staff primarily, as well as other heads of people, HRBPs, other people leaders. And we work with high growth companies like Perplexity, Mercor, Lambda, Remote, HubSpot, Zapier, Automatic, etc. We help them save a lot of time, money, and stress when planning team retreats globally. And so there's two ways that we can help you. One is you can go to offsite.com, make a free account, and search our Airbnb style marketplace. I just put a link in the webinar chat. You can sign up. It's free. There's no credit card required. Looks exactly like Airbnb. And we've partnered with thousands of curated venues and vendors globally. So you can save up to 50% when booking a room block, meeting space, swag, photographers, videographers, basically any venue or vendor you would need for an offsite. And then we also do end-to-end offsite planning as a done-for-you white glove service. We've built a team of dedicated offsite planners internally who are expert former chiefs of staff, former EAs, former people leaders, and can help you think really strategically about how to use an offsite to increase employee engagement, retention, and alignment. And they do everything with and for you. So all the venue selection, negotiating, contracting, we can help you build an agenda hour by hour, build a budget line item by line item, pay for ourselves 2 to 3x with all the venues and vendors savings and the time savings. Really just take everything off your hands so you can focus on the highest ROI, most transformative offsite, and also doing your other 17 jobs as a chief of staff. And so go to offsite.com to learn more. Also, if you want to email me, jared@offsite.com, we just put together a report where we looked at all of the offsites that we planned in Q1, all the various searches in our marketplace, and built a trends report to basically show you like what are the hottest destinations right now, what are the best ways to save lots of money. It's a 5-page report. And so just email like jared@offsite.com, put Nova in the subject, and I'll send you the report. But anyways, that's my time. And, I'm really excited for you to hear from Maggie because I've heard from her and her team in the past, and they put out incredible content. So their free stuff is better than most people's paid stuff.
Thanks, Jared.
Yeah, I think you're in line for an amazing, 45 minutes to an hour up ahead.
Thanks, Jared. Awesome. Well, we appreciate you being here and keeping this event free for everybody on. Welcome everyone. We are going to dive into really all things chief of staff. I could probably talk for 4 hours. And, I just got back from a three-day conference where we teach in person for 3 days, and talk about all of this content just constantly. That said, I'm going to start with telling you a little bit about Nova, a little bit about something really exciting happening right now. And then I'm going to tell you what I'm going to talk about. We're going to go through a few slides, and then I'm going to remove the slides, so it'll just be me up here kind of going through all the things, and then we're going to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So that said, if you are new to this ecosystem of Nova Chief of Staff, we have been really setting the gold standard for Chief of Staff education and development for the last 3 years since I built Nova's Chief of Staff certification course. Started as an online course, took off by storm, really, really well received by chief of staffs, aspiring chiefs of staff, and executive assistants, both who are looking to promote and move out of the EA role, and a lot of executive assistants who love their current job, but they want to think about how to be more strategic, how to add value in their current role, especially with the times changing in automation, AI, and all of the things. With the future of work. So we have over 2,000 students at this point across 1,500 companies and 45 countries. Half of our students are executive assistants. And again, half of them looking to promote, the other half just want to add more value in their role. Now, what's really exciting is today kicks off our summer sale. We never go on sale. We don't promote. I don't like being a like promotional kind of environment world. So we only do it twice a year. We run the summer sale right now through the end of June, and then we have a price change event or a promotion event, excuse me, at the end of the year. And I like to do it in June, in this like early, kind of like end of May, June timeframe, because this is the time where this predominantly women-driven field of executive assistants and chiefs of staff are doing everything and anything for everybody else. And we're kind of lost. We're planning the summer camps and we're planning the trips and we're just doing so much at home and taking ourselves out of like the self-care environment that I know a lot of us strive to be in, that when we think about this time of year, we want to give back to this predominantly women-driven field, although, thank you to the men who are on this call as well. We appreciate you too, and offer $350 off of our online course. Our course never drops in price, especially like that. $350 off. Now is the time to join. I hope to see a bunch of you on student kickoff calls. We'll probably enroll 80 to 100 people in the next month or so, based on this summer sale. So it's a really exciting time. You can use the code SUMMER350 at our checkout page to sign up for Nova's course. I'm going to dive into a lot of things, tons of stuff, and you can find so many resources within Nova's ecosystem. We have a free resource library. We have events that are recapped. You will get the recording of this event. You can find blogs. You can find content on LinkedIn every single day, Instagram, TikTok, all over the place. Predominantly, what I'm going to talk about today and all of these other resources that I've shared are the what. Nova's course is the how. It is sitting there and building briefs. It's sitting there and building executive project management templates. It's sitting there and considering your executive presence and how to increase it. It's building confidence and validation that you can do the role of chief of staff and you know where to start and what it is and how to get after it. That's the difference between what you're going to find in Nova's course versus what you're going to find in all of these other resources. So we're going to get into it. I appreciate you hanging on here while we kind of introduce everything. And I'll talk again at the end about our summer sale, but that's the big exciting thing happening right now. All right, so a few slides. I'm going to chat through what a chief of staff is, my definition, how it relates to other C-suite roles, and some of the key aspects that make someone a strong chief of staff and what the day-to-day can look like. That's going to be on the slides. I'm going to remove the slides and just, chat through a bunch of other things. And that's going to include EA versus chief of staff, some of the similarities and differences, the EA chief of staff relationship, why we don't love to combine EA and chief of staff roles, but sometimes what the real world does look like with combined roles. I'm going to talk through kind of the core purpose of the role versus the day-to-day. And I'm going to dive into how the chief of staff role has a lot of different titles. It lives at a lot of different levels and that you can find it across all industries. Again, we're going to make sure we touch on who makes a great chief of staff, the daily responsibilities of a chief of staff, breadth versus depth, when a CEO needs a chief of staff, and paths to chief of staff and out of chief of staff. So anything else, put in the Q&A box. Again, this is a little housekeeping, but I'm not looking at the chat. I will get too distracted. I'm looking at the Q&A box. If you go to your bar in Zoom and see the 3 dots that say more, there should be something that says question and answer. That's where you're going to put your questions. It might be an icon already on your bar. For me, it's in the more section. That's where you're putting your questions. I'm going to leave a lot of time for Q&A. Okay. That said, let's dive into these slides here, and you will get the recording of this Nova chat. So don't worry, you can take snips or you can, handwrite, but just know you're getting the recording as well. This is really the only slide I'm going to read off of, and I probably don't even need to. I say it so often, but the chief of staff definition is a business leader's right hand and strategic thought partner focused on executing, organizing, and prioritizing the leader's business initiatives and driving transparency and alignment across the leadership team. A chief of staff exists to maximize leaders' time and exponentially increase their impact. We're going to come back to how to compare and dive into a little bit more around the definitions here. When we think about the chief of staff role versus other roles, the way I like to start is by talking about the executive assistant role and what it is. And the biggest thing that I focus on here is that most EA roles hold the core components of inbox, travel, expense, logistics, and scheduling. Most of those items are going to be held by an executive assistant. And that's the core of most EA roles. Now, anybody in any job, and of course, excellent executive assistants, are going to reach and grab and take on additional projects, and they're going to add more strategic value to their role. But the nature of those 5 core items are tactical. The day-to-day is more tactical. The chief of staff should be in the loop on all of those items. I like to think of it as like read access. They're in the loop. They know where the leader's going. They know what's coming in and out of their day-to-day. They know the processes that are involved in the leader's logistics. But the chief of staff is operating at kind of that strategic level with the business leader, having conversations about really the leader's vision, where the company's going, what the plans are. And then that chief of staff is executing that leader's vision. The chief of staff should be really strong administratively and strong strategically to be able to build tools, systems, processes, collect a bunch of information, and then turn them into really like transparent documents, into strategic plans to move business forward and to make recommendations to improve the business. I'll talk a little bit more about EA versus chief of staff here in a bit. Chief of staff versus chief operating officer. The easiest way to differentiate these two is by thinking about the chief operating officer as existing for the company, where the chief of staff exists for the business leader. In reality, they both report to and work on the things the business leader wants them to, but the chief of staff role, just like the EA role, exists for a business leader. It exists to align their back office, align their team, make their life smoother, make sure they're very prepared, trickle down their vision, bubble up culture. They're that leader's right hand. The chief operating officer generally has like a scorecard and a category of business and a whole team and sector of a company that they're responsible for, but they're both heavy operational roles. Now, HR is on here too. Some of us might laugh like, oh my gosh, chief of staff's not HR, but you would be surprised by how many people think that it is. Maybe it's the title. Think of HR as, company's people, and chief of staff as the business leader's initiatives and the business leader's people. The chief of staff is also really concerned with culture, just like HR, but definitely not an HR function role, just one of many things that the chief of staff is responsible for kind of keeping in touch with. So I believe this is the last slide here that we're going to talk through, and then I'll remove these slides here, but it doesn't matter where you come from as chief of staff, and we'll get into that here in a minute. It's how you approach your work. Now, I talk a lot about who makes a great chief of staff, and those characteristics are a lot more important than previous consulting experience or previous, MBA or, where you've been. It's who you are. It's, they're not all listed here. I'll go through these as well, but it's being that like driven achiever, that fast learner. It's a high trust role, someone that builds trust quickly, somebody that asks a lot of questions, somebody that can work with a lot of different personality types, a lot of different people. You'll see on this list, emotionally intelligent, collaborative, okay behind the scenes. You're putting someone else up on stage. Sometimes people want the spotlight. They want to be out there. And if that's you, chief of staff might not be right for you. You'd have to determine that with your business leader to see what gaps they have that the chief of staff is going to be filling. Brave, inspiring, they're the people lifting other people up. They're the people bringing groups of people together to accomplish things. It's a people-driven role. Now, what chiefs of staff actually do the day-to-day, I'll talk about the core purpose versus the day-to-day here in a minute, but on this slide, you can see all chiefs of staff, almost all chiefs of staff everywhere should lead or own at least some aspect, if not the entire rhythm of business. The rhythm of business is all of the sessions that your leader is involved in that are driving business forward. When is your leader pulled in to make important decisions? Do those sessions exist? It's really common that there's a gap here. Like it's really common that, let's say your leader's talking a lot about marketing, there's a new CMO, and they're not getting their eyes on the marketing material enough, and you're hearing about it. Well, if you consider your rhythm of business, is there a strategic marketing meeting every month? Maybe there's not. Maybe that's where the chief of staff steps in and makes a recommendation to improve the rhythm of business. Chiefs of staff at the beginning should step in and document the current state of the rhythm of business as one of the first things they do. If you want me to talk more about the rhythm of business, let me know in the Q&A. We also have a workshop available that should be live on our site really, really soon that dives into like 75 minutes of how to build your executive's rhythm of business. Leader preparedness. Every chief of staff should be really, really focused on ensuring that your leader is spending their time the right way. And one of the best ways to do this, like simply said, is making sure they're prepared. But you have to figure out how they like to be prepared and what the best process is to prepare them. Are you preparing a brief? Is someone on the team writing the brief? Are you approving it? When does it go to your leader? Leader preparedness can mean a lot of different things, but the core foundation is really critical that chiefs of staff everywhere own. Strategic execution, executing that leader's vision, taking the leader out of that execution. That's one of the biggest roles of chief of staff. Filling gaps. The chief of staff role has an endless amount of possibility and breadth to it. Chiefs of staff can step in and run programs. They can fill a maternity leave. They can build a process. They can implement a tech platform. They can run an employee newsletter. It could be a lot of different components of filling gaps. And then listening, observing, and connecting dots across culture, dynamics, and bubbling up what's most important to the leader. Okay, so those are the slides there. I am now going to speak to you about some of the other components of chief of staff. Again, you'll get this recording. I don't have slides for all of this, but across all of the Nova ecosystem resources, you will find a lot of this information if you want to double click into it. All right. The chief of staff and EA are similar because they both can operate as the glue that holds a team together. They both should know really anything and everything that's happening with that executive, from the tactical to the strategic level. Where are they going? What are they doing? What are they talking about? And what is most important to them? The way that these roles are different. The chief of staff is going to be extremely proactive in assuming that anything and everything is the chief of staff's job. In reality, the chief of staff can't do anything and everything, but in practice, great chiefs of staff are going to be the person that captures anything and everything that the leader throws out, anything and everything that the leader has as a priority. And that chief of staff is probably going to turn these items into some type of project management document or a walking deck of priorities. And the chief of staff is going to figure out what should the chief of staff themselves be leading, who should be leading the other areas that the chief of staff may not have the expertise in or just make sense to land somewhere else. How is information flowing back to the leader? And is the business moving along? Are all these items moving along? And the chief of staff is very proactive in their approach to assuming everything is theirs. The executive assistant role, by nature, by those five, kind of characteristics of responsibility, inbox, travel, expense, logistics, and scheduling, those are tactical by nature. And a lot of strategic executive assistants are thinking about how to get ahead of this work, how to be more strategic. I mean, that's why many of you are here, how to take on more responsibility. But there's this proactive bias for action for a chief of staff that should assume that they are honestly owning everything, even when other people are the doers. The chief of staff has their eyes across all areas of the business, including the business priorities, not just the leader's back office. So those are some of the differences here. The EA and chief of staff relationship, the two of them, critical. And I like to say that it's often more important, the EA and chief of staff relationship, than either of their relationships with the principal, with the leader, because in a lot of cases, that leader is back to back all day long in meetings, or they're traveling, 3.5 weeks out of 4 a month. And between the EA and chief of staff, the knowledge that you can share, the way that you can work together, the information you can bring each other in on, can honestly move mountains. And this relationship should be incredibly prioritized. So if you're a chief of staff, or you're going to be a chief of staff, and you're walking into this new chief of staff role, I like to talk about how the chief of staff should really be approaching with a learner's mindset, be approaching really curiously, because usually the EA has been in their role a lot longer. And we should understand that the EA is going to probably be curious and a little concerned about, what is this new chief of staff going to do? How's my job going to change? And the most important thing for a chief of staff when they're new is to build trust and to build relationships. And this EA chief of staff relationship is critical. Chief of staff approaches with curiosity and learns the day-to-day of the executive assistant. Any chief of staff anywhere should know exactly how that EA runs in their role, how they're managing that inbox, how the leader likes to, get information, how that EA is kind of managing all the things that's coming into them, and what their job responsibility is, what all those ownership pieces are, and how the EA works. That's first for a chief of staff. Now, an executive assistant should approach this chief of staff relationship, assuming the good, positive haze, and with a teaching mindset. Let me teach them how things work here. Let me show them what I do. Let me show them how the executive likes to receive information. And, approaching in these ways as a duo here is going to help the EA chief of staff relationship tremendously. And you're both just going to be so successful and on fire with whatever you focus on. One of the other things I like to talk about when we think about EA and chief of staff is, what if these roles are combined? And I, as a rule, do not ever say that you should combine an EA and chief of staff role. The chief of staff role has to be able to zoom out and think really strategically across the whole business. They need to be able to execute, solve a problem, build a process, and then zoom right on out and go and see what is the next highest priority to go and solve. And when you are capturing, and spending 70% of your time sometimes on the core EA functions of the details of where your leaders go in and, all of those tactical functions, it's really, really hard for a chief of staff to be able to zoom out and solve bigger, higher impact strategic problems. And that's why I don't like these combined roles. I don't think that either role can really shine in that combined area. And usually you're not necessarily being paid as a chief of staff. Sometimes you are. However, in reality, a lot of times in order to move from EA to chief of staff, the role is going to be combined, at least at first. And I usually focus with people on considering how to have the conversation around time bounding this shared role, and thinking about how to offer the leader your support in hiring a backfill, in considering the work that needs to find a home rather than necessarily a new role. Considering, maybe the new EA reports to that new chief of staff for a short period of time, since that chief of staff was the EA previously, but then there is a time when that leader needs to go and report to the EA needs to go and report to the leader moving forward. I do not recommend that EAs report to chiefs of staff. EAs should report to the leader they support. Removing access is never good for an EA, and you all know that, and I'm sure agree. There are exceptions to all of this, but I do not like EA and chief of staff combined roles. EA should report to the business leader. Jumping around here, chief of staff structure in the C-suite. A lot of people think that there's only one chief of staff in a company and it reports to the CEO. That is not the case. Some companies, that is the case, but in a lot of companies, there's actually a chief of staff structure throughout the entire organization. And the chief of staff could report to the CEO. You could have chiefs of staff that report to the VPs that report to the CEO. You could have chiefs of staff that report to the directors that report to the VPs. The chief of staff is really intended for any business leader, any size of company, any sector, any industry, that is heads down, chasing too many deliverables and just not having enough time to focus on strategy, leadership, and the core function of the CEO job. So if your business leader is heads down, focusing on chasing tactical items and follow-ups and initiatives, and they're not eyes up, focused on the future, and it's a fast-moving business and they just don't have enough time to do everything, that's a good indicator of when they probably need a chief of staff. And of course, they have to have the funding for it. Speaking of funding, the chief of staff role can exist across so many different salary levels and compensation packages. At smaller companies, startups, depending on where we are in the country, in the US, the chief of staff role can be 90 to 100,000. Most chiefs of staff roles are going to be around 130, 140 and up, upwards of 300, 350 and even higher at times. And this is because the chief of staff role can exist across a lot of different levels. Chiefs of staff can be executives, chiefs of staff can be directors, VPs, chiefs of staff can be managers or senior managers. When you are more senior in the chief of staff role, it usually means that you have more years of experience and more industry expertise. And when you're a more senior chief of staff, you're able to act as proxy and advisor in more capacities than a more junior chief of staff. But when we think about the chief of staff role as a whole, Anywhere and everywhere, the core function, that core definition is the same. So let me talk about that a little bit. The core purpose of the chief of staff role is to prepare the leader, to align their executive team, to fill gaps across the business, to trickle down that leader's vision, to bubble up culture, to solve problems across the business. That core purpose of the role is the same everywhere and the same across all chief of staff levels. Now, the day-to-day of a chief of staff can be very, very different everywhere. The day-to-day of a tech chief of staff could be still focusing on return to office here in 2026. It could be implementing a new platform across a team. It could be planning an offsite or an all hands for the executive team. In the food and beverage industry, a chief of staff to a founder of a giant restaurant group could be really focused on training programs and design teams and launches. The chief of staff to a head coach at a football program. One of my friends is chief of staff to a giant football program. His day-to-day is player detail, player food, game day stats. It is recruiting events. It is major travel planning for teams, for his team when they're traveling. It's making sure that the staff is aligned with that coach's vision. And that's the core purpose of the role. The core purpose of the role in food and beverage, sports, tech, it's the same. Preparing the leader, aligning their team, solving gaps, running programs, trickling up culture, making sure the vision is trickled down. Hopefully that helps kind of thinking about core purpose versus day-to-day. Now, something that's also really important to talk about here is the many different titles of chief of staff. I think it's actually more common to not have a chief of staff title, but be in a chief of staff role than it is to actually be in a chief of staff role with the chief of staff title. There are 40 plus different titles that exist that describe chief of staff. And we have resources for you on this in our blog and in our free resource library that can actually help you think about what title would be right for you if chief of staff is not adopted by your company. And there's a lot of reasons for this. The chief of staff role by title, may not be used in a company. It may not be liked. It may not be understood. All of those things are out of our control. What's most important is being able to identify what chief of staff work is. And that is one of the reasons you're on this call. And that's really what I want you to walk away with here. Because some of you, and I hear this all the time, I'm on TikTok now and people are commenting, hey, I think I'm a chief of staff and I didn't know it until just now. And the way to spot chief of staff work is if you think about your company and you think about a leader that is in your ecosphere, who is the person actually filling out their decks for them? Let's say you're the EA to the CEO, and as the EA to CEO, you're asking for decks from all of their direct reports for a board presentation. Who's the person on their team that's actually the one putting the deck together? Who's the person on a leader's team that's actually the one putting an all hands deck together for the population of their employees? Who's the one running the slides in the back if it's not the EA? Who's the person on their team that's just trusted to help them and get things done? That is the chief of staff, even if it's under a different title. And those titles could be business planning manager, transformation director, strategic initiatives, business operations. The title really is so much less important. It's who is that strategic right hand, that person right next to the business leader that they trust to get done important work. And often they're helping with big work and making sure that it's in on time and submitted. And they're often doing the heavy lifting of the work. They're aligning the team. They're making sure the whole team for that leader is on the same page. That's the chief of staff. And when we can start spotting chief of staff work, we can start seeing a path for ourselves, or we can tell that we're already doing the chief of staff job, which is helpful. But if we can see a path to a chief of staff role, if it's under another title, the world opens up because now we have all these other roles and this identity that can help us figure out what we want to do and what we're good at and what we're drawn to. Now, again, it's not the most important thing to have the chief of staff title. What's most important is to realize you're doing chief of staff work or that you want to, so that you can find resources to support you. And that's why Nova Chief of Staff is here. And also so that you can figure out what your role charter is. What's the point of the chief of staff role? What should you do first, second, and third? What is owning the rhythm of business? These are things that are ambiguous and hard to understand, but great chiefs of staff are really strong and understand these items, and they often have to learn it themselves, which is, why we built chief of staff company, a chief of staff company, because we don't want you to have to do this by yourself. A couple more things, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. One of the most important things is to think about the chief of staff role as a breadth role rather than a depth role. The coolest thing about chief of staff is that you can dive into whatever you're best suited to solve, depending on if it's a big company priority, if it makes a lot of sense for you to jump into that. What I mean is I am a strong project manager. And I saw a big gap when I was in my chief of staff role that nobody was leading major initiatives. It was like, hey, we need to do this. Well, we'll go back to the return to office idea here because, of course, the return to office is still everywhere. And 3 years ago, it was obviously even bigger. We need to make sure that everybody's coming back into the office. And how do we do that? And we just went through a big team move. We moved offices. We moved buildings. Who's going to own that? Well, there's no chief return to office officer. There's no, it didn't quite make sense for the operations role in our team because ops was closer to sales. So a lot of times when there's no one else to take on a project naturally, it falls to the chief of staff. And I have been a strong project manager based on previous experience. So I was able to lean in and raise my hand for project management style, like initiative leading. And I brought teams together and I built project management documents and I pushed work along, and I was strong in that area. Now, if you're really a strong facilitator, if you are really good, a really great speaker, and your leader actually doesn't really want to do that kind of heavy lifting in front of people on stage, if you want to stay really connected to employee culture because that's just who you are, that's the coolest part about the chief of staff role. You can dive into whatever makes the most sense based on what you're best suited to solve and the company priorities and your leader's opportunities. Now, it's a breadth game. So anytime where a chief of staff takes on a new responsibility, we don't want that chief of staff to just own and own and own new things because then their workload is totally at capacity. The goal of a chief of staff is to zoom out, think about what's most important, the biggest priority on the team, something that somebody else is not solving, or you're implementing new systems, tools, processes to solve problems, and you're diving in and you're doing that. You're creating a tool, you're building a process, you're implementing something, and then the goal of the chief of staff is to zoom right back out at that breadth level and think about the whole business again, and then zoom right back in. That means that you could potentially be building something and then you're operationalizing it and you're delegating it and making sure that it's still running, and then you're coming back out and you're moving right on. So it's a breadth game, not a depth game. A lot of people have a lack of confidence around certain areas that could be more technical in your industry or financial in your industry. And I'm sure people are nodding here because it's really common when I talk about this that people are like, yes, I don't feel super confident financially, or I don't feel super confident in my business's like scientific expertise. So how could I be a chief of staff? That is not the chief of staff role. You do not need a technical level of expertise in most chief of staff roles or the deep financial understanding of the business in most chief of staff roles. What you do need to do is understand the most important things, the top 3 to 5 financial metrics, the most important tech components, like of maybe a more scientific-based business. The very, very top component, like a 101 course, that's it. That's what you need to understand. And you need to build resources to help you dive deep when needed. And you need to have the confidence that you can figure anything out. That is the work of a chief of staff. Almost everything's going to be brand new. We're going to be doing something for the first time. It might be outside of our previous level of experience or expertise, but we've got to have the confidence and the resources to be able to dive in and figure it out. That's the chief of staff role. I worked for a major telecom company. I will tell you that all of the VPs I worked with, there was like 1 or 2 that understood the technology really, really deeply of Wi-Fi and 5G and all the things. Nobody else really understood it, but we did and do understand how to use resources, how to solve problems, how to figure out what we need to figure out. But the reality is like that deep industry expertise is only necessary with certain roles. And the chief of staff role is about solving problems, preparing your leader, aligning teams. Like Secondary is that deeper expertise. So we've got to understand the big things and be able to dive deep when we need to, but we have to have the confidence to be okay zooming out and playing the breadth game, not the depth game, or we're going to miss things as chiefs of staff. So really important to touch on there. Final thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to dive into questions here, is that there is any and every single path into chief of staff and out of chief of staff. There is not one path. There's a lot of executive assistants moving into the chief of staff role that, the best, most strategic, highest level, achiever-focused executive assistants, they're having conversations with their leaders and they're moving into the chief of staff role, whether it was them to raise their hand or their leader to push them along and say, I see you, I want you to keep, moving along here, move forward, let's make you into a chief of staff. There are attorneys, doctors, there are previous entrepreneurs, CEOs that go into the chief of staff role. There are people who, anything and everything, every single industry, every single background, we are hearing about people moving into the chief of staff role. It's, I'm having conversations every single day with chiefs of staff and business leaders, and it is unlimited the amount of paths previous to chief of staff. When you think about after chief of staff, people can move into roles like operations directors, COO roles. If you're really drawn to marketing, you could move into like marketing roles. You could move into HR if that's where you love. I moved into entrepreneurship. I learned a lot in my chief of staff role because I got to witness business leaders every single day and how they ran a company and what they prioritized and how they led. And then I moved into entrepreneurship. That's also common. There's really no, I think it's the best thing you can do for your career is consider a chief of staff role because you get so much visibility both on you and yourself into what you could go do. And if you're networking and having conversations consistently with people and highlighting your work, I just think the world is your oyster once you're a chief of staff. So I obviously, you could call me biased, but I think I'm just well researched in the role. It's a great role for people who are thinking about what's next in their career. So that said, I'm going to move into Q&A. Feel free to pop any questions into the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen, and we will dive in. All right. I have a couple questions here. I'm going to touch on these first, and then I'll touch on them at the end of the call. As a reminder, I talked about this at the very beginning. Nova is in a period right now, we launched today, where we are doing a summer sale. It's our 3rd anniversary this June. So between May 15th and June 30th, we're offering $350 off our online course. We're probably going to have 80 to 100 people enroll over the next 6 weeks. So we hope that's you. I'd love to see you on a kickoff call soon. Again, our course is the how. How do we build a brief? How do we do executive project management? How do we think more strategically? All of this is kind of the what. Okay, some of these questions. I'm an executive coach looking to add to my offerings and would love to hear how my skill set would map to chief of staff. I think I'd need to know a little bit more about your coaching skill set, but the qualities that make a great chief of staff, I'm going to repeat here. Driven, achievement-focused, fast, collaborative, high emotional intelligence, really good at working with a lot of different people, enjoys breadth over depth, and is highly, highly trusted. So I don't think it's about where you've been. I think it's about who you are that makes a great chief of staff. Best resource for a chief of staff job description for an independent private school. I think that anybody interested in the chief of staff role or moving into one needs to deeply understand the chief of staff role yourself first, meaning what's the definition? What are the core components of the role? What's the day-to-day of the role? And you can find all of that in this call, in this chat, and in a lot of Nova's resources. We don't share a job description because, as I mentioned, the day-to-day of the job can be very, very different for every single company. The core purpose is the same. And we talk a lot about the core purpose. So there's a ton of resources out there for you in Nova's ecosphere. Will you come to New York City for an in-person certification? Okay, I love that. We'll put it on our list. Thank you. No plans yet for New York City. We will be in Nashville in September and November. September is APC, Administrative Professionals Conference, and November is EA Ignite Fall. And we will be live in person for 3 days at both of those conferences, usually with 100 or 150 students. There is nothing like being in a room full of people learning together. So if you can make it happen, come to one of our in-person conferences. What's the biggest mindset or behavioral shift you've seen successful executive assistants make when transitioning into a true chief of staff role? Yeah, I think there's a couple. I usually have EAs write on a post-it note, zoom out on a sticky and put it on their computer, because when you are used to being in the details, there's like major dopamine hits from checking off all the things you all know. It's why we love these roles, like check, 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 check. But that's a huge shift. We've got to zoom out and start thinking about a lot more than just the tactical nature of the role. And then I think the other biggest shift is moving from a bit more reactive to a bit more proactive. It's hard to know because there's so many different levels of EAs, but some EAs, as you know, are a bit more reactive. I need you to do this. Here's a list of things. Here's a list from the leader. Okay, great. You're going to do it and you're going to do it well. The chief of staff role is proactive in anticipating exactly what's coming, in leading initiatives that have no other owners, in thinking about how they capture everything, even if it's not given to them. They're listening, they're taking it on, and they're extremely proactive in how they're thinking. So zooming out, proactive versus reactive. For someone already operating in a hybrid EA and strategic operations role, how would you recommend intentionally bridging the gap into a formal chief of staff position? I am going to point you to Nova's free resource library. We have 3 or 4, maybe more different documents in there, all about EA to chief of staff. We've got a reflection on, what you're strong at, how to position yourself. We have a whole pitch guide, how to build slides, how to, formally have that conversation. And we have a lot of other resources there too. But again, I think it comes down to deeply understanding the chief of staff role, how it can add value to your leader. You're positioning it for them, not for you. And that most of the time is still a miss that even senior folks make when applying or pitching jobs. It's, I'm ready for this. I know I can do it. This is what I've been waiting for, and I'm really strong. Let's forget all that. How does this benefit your leader? This will allow me to do X, Y, and Z for you. You talk a lot about needing this, capability on the team. This is what I'm going to step into after hearing what you're saying. That is how we want to position everything, really, for people if we want to get what we want. Okay. So deeply understand the chief of staff role. Think about how you position it. And honestly, there are so many people who are just like you, EA, strategic operators, thinking about chief of staff. This is the time to go through Nova's course. Check out Google. We have, I think, almost or over 200 5-star reviews at this point. We've got a ton of case studies. The material is very, very relevant to exactly what the core purpose of the chief of staff role is, even though the day-to-day that you're in can look different. That is what we teach. And I would recommend you pop into Nova's course. Okay. I'm gonna keep moving here. I'm skipping the ones that I've already touched on. If you're currently in the course and you're moving through, keep going, finish the course, get through to the end. It's hard to be in a self-paced course if you're in the online version. But so much learning happens through every single assignment. You finish the first assignment, and then you look at what examples of what right looks like. And then there's a bunch of learnings that happen there. The course builds on itself. So if you're wondering, gosh, how do I change my mindset, EA to chief of staff? It's coming. There's a lot towards the end of the course that talk about first 90 days as a chief of staff, or, what to do as an EA when you get back to work post-course. Stick with it. All of that learning will come. Can you talk more about the rhythm of business? Yes, I can. So, Christina or Krista on my team will post something in the chat that will let folks know when our Rhythm of Business workshop will be ready. I think it's going to be around $45. It's a bit of a supplement to our course. It dives deep into how to start building the rhythm of business for your leader. And again, what the Rhythm of Business is, it's all of the sessions that your leader's involved in that drive business forward. So if you're sitting in a session and people are asking your leader things, approvals, feedback, like those are strategic sessions where those category leaders need input from your leader. That's a session that drives business forward. As a chief of staff, especially when we're new or if you haven't done this yet, we want to document the rhythm of business as one of the first things we do so that we can see current state really, really clearly. We have a rhythm of business template in our free resource library. It's like fan favorite, everybody's favorite rhythm of business template. We also have 20 or 30 different templates available for purchase. If you don't go through our course, I recommend going through our course. It's the rhythm of business template pack is expensive anyway. Go through the course so that you can learn how to use all those templates. But we've got 7 or 8 rhythm of business templates in our template pack as well. That said, you're going to document the current state of the rhythm of business. What are all the key sessions? When are we looking back at past business? When are we looking forward at strategic planning next month, next year? When are we looking down operationally? HR updates, operational updates, sales updates. You're going to put this all ideally into one slide that's organized by maybe weekly, monthly, quarterly sessions. And ideally, you're going to be able to see what the session's called, who's the session leader, what success looks like, maybe the date and time of these sessions. You're going to have this rhythm of business. And then as you start getting more and more connected to the business, which means I think everybody on this call, strategic EAs and chiefs of staff, should all be having consistent one-on-ones with everybody that reports to their leader. That needs to happen for a lot of different reasons, but basically, the biggest one is so that you can connect dots across the business because you're going to be hearing lots of different things from all these leaders. And once you're connecting these dots across the business, you're going to start to hear themes and you're going to start to connect those themes to what you hear from your leader as their priorities. And that's when you might say, hey, my leader's talking about this a lot. Maybe it's, again, the marketing example, talking about needing more time with the CMO and not really being in the loop on marketing initiatives and marketing planning. And I know from my rhythm of business and from connecting dots across the team that we don't have any marketing sessions on our rhythm of business besides maybe a one-on-one. And that's where the chief of staff, once they know the current state and they understand the business, they can start making strategic recommendations to improve the business because they're connecting dots, they're listening to their leader, and they understand current state of all the things going on. And that kind of world cannot just live in our brains. It has to be documented. So my approach to the chief of staff role is heavily administrative and strategic. The administrative backbone, the structure that we offer gives way to creativity. It allows us to be creative and problem solvers because now we have this structure that we can see. Now we have this, documented state that we can see. Our team is aligned through transparent documents or templates or whatever it is. We bring this rigor and structure so that we can be flexible, so that it can breed creativity. It's a role that combines administrative and strategic skills, and both are really, really important in the chief of staff role. So owning the rhythm of business as a chief of staff is critical. And we have a 75-minute session that you can purchase as a workshop to help you build your rhythm of business. Okay. A bunch of questions here about how to get CEOs to do what we want them to do when they don't really know what a chief of staff is. Unfortunately, that is our own job to help leaders understand the chief of staff role. I wish it wasn't, but it's an ambiguous role that a lot of people don't understand. And if you spend enough time with Nova, if you go through our course, if you digest all of our materials, you're going to start to deeply understand the chief of staff role and then figure out how to position it to your leader. So that's on you. How do we position this? How do I help them understand what a chief of staff role is? How do I categorize my work and communicate the value of my work sitting over here in the strategic chief of staff mindset area versus maybe some of these more administrative areas that potentially we could find another owner for? Got a few questions about AI. What practices or disciplines have you seen around AI governance for a chief of staff? We will be doing a Nova Chat later this year that's dedicated to AI as a chief of staff. This question makes me think about, it really will depend on so many things, how involved a chief of staff is in their company's, AI exploration or policy creating. But a lot of chiefs of staff are going to be responsible for either increasing the implementation of AI or building AI policy. And I know that can feel like a lot of pressure because we are all navigating and learning the ever-changing landscape of AI. And it's not perfect yet. It still takes a lot of time. There's still a lot of research out there that says the AI adoption is actually taking more of our time right now. It's not reducing time. And yet we still need to be exploring. So my feedback is that, and this is what I do myself too, is to try to just take a deep breath and remove the urgency around, I've got to adopt AI into every single workflow that I have across my company, and instead turn it more into like an exploration mindset. I'm going to spend a couple hours a week learning a new tool or a new, function of Claude or whatever's coming out, the latest thing. So maybe I'm going to spend a couple hours seeing how this Claude co-work task automation can work for me or for a workflow. I'm going to spend a few hours checking out this tool that my company has been pushing us to use. As a chief of staff, maybe you are setting some guidelines for your team around what they're exploring, what they're using. We have a AI policy writing guide for chiefs of staff in Nova's free resource library. You can check that out. We had an AI policy discussion for a Nova chat last year, and I think it's still really valid because like anything else, the chief of staff may step in and have to apply an executive project management approach to implementing AI policy. And that means pulling in key stakeholders. Like any other project, it means pushing work forward. It means, highly collaborative, using experts when needed, but it's a really, really good skill for a chief of staff to take on. So, all right. We only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to try to choose a couple more questions that relate to a lot of different people here. Someone's asking about pay raises from EA to chief of staff. What's appropriate internally, externally? Generally, internally, I don't think you're going to get more than a 10 or 15% raise if you move functions. There's exceptions to that, absolutely, but that's where I would target a big move from EA to chief of staff, and it is a big move. You're probably moving leadership levels, unless you're in a very elevated EA role. You're most likely moving leadership levels. So I would aim for a 10 to 15%. A 3 or 4% is just you're doing a good job. Here's a bit of a raise. I don't believe that that's a realistic percent increase for a major role change. What would you recommend to someone who completed Nova's course and is looking for their next steps here in professional development? So I'm going to take this two ways. The chief of staff role should be if you're looking for a role, nearly 95% networking versus cold applying. It's a very high trust role, and a business leader has to kind of personally know you a little bit or trust you a lot, or somebody on their team really trusts you to move you into a role that's going to be shadowing them constantly. They're going to want to be around you. So you've got to put in the work to build a relationship before they're even looking for a chief of staff a lot of times. So if you're like, what should I be doing now? Or, what should I just be doing anyway? If I'm trying to find a chief of staff role, you should be networking. And you should be setting goals. Like maybe it's 3 to 6 people a month that you're talking to about what they're up to, what your goals are. Maybe you can slip in, here's what a chief of staff is. Here's, how this could add a lot of value to a leader. But you are just networking for the purpose of networking, because usually it's somebody that they talk to who's going to need a chief of staff. And then that's when you may meet somebody that you could be the chief of staff for in the future. It is not a simple role to just cold apply for and get the job. We've got to be networking constantly. In terms of additional professional development for chiefs of staff, well, I built Nova for a reason. There was no company out there that existed in the world that was teaching chiefs of staff how to be chiefs of staff, like the daily functions of the chief of staff role, mirrored after actual responsibilities. So there are not a lot of other resources out there. There's membership communities that you can find. There are books. I would just continue to digest different, resources, like go and dive into some of the optional assignments in our course that are a little bit more like niche specific around topics that might not relate to everybody. Like go through all of those things and just read, digest, and ingest as much as possible, and think about maybe other areas where you could improve, like leadership or speaking, something like that. Okay. I am so sorry. We cannot get through all the rest of the questions here. Final note for everybody is that Nova is having our twice yearly sale right now to celebrate our anniversary. It's $350 off our self-paced online course. We never go on sale. $350 off is the biggest we ever offer. And we're probably going to have 80 to 100 folks join us over the next 6 weeks. So I hope to see you on a kickoff call soon. And anytime, please feel free to email hello@novachiefofstaff.com and we can help you with any questions that you have. We also have discovery calls with some of our grad students that you could hop on. If you have questions about Nova's course, that's also a really good route. And you will get the recording of this event. So thank you all so much for being here and keep in touch with us. See you later.